Delicate Subject. Chapter 3. She woke with a start, but didn't go far. Arms were around her. Twisting, she turned to look. Thane's solemn face was looking down at her. They were on the couch. She was on his lap, her head against his chest. Sleep, Siha. You have only slept a few hours. Garrus is on duty. I will be here when you wake. Reassured, she fell back asleep with his lips pressed to her hair. She woke next in bed, room dark except for a few glowing bits of electronics and the light from the fish tank. Automatic checklists lit up her head. Late for work? No. Garrus in charge. Sleep? Clock shows 12 hours. Mission? Headed toward Ilium. Shore leave. Not dead or tortured in a Vakarian prison. Not responsible for genocide. She owed the last two to the man whose arms were around her. She was tired and awake, grateful and horrified, and above all, absolutely safe in this moment from judgment. The thought of Thane led to the thought of Erica, which led to grief, which led to Urim, and she could barely catch her breath in the presence of all the swarming unspokens that swamped her in the open and trusting silence. She started to cry, which she did silently, muscles tense and eyes closed, not resisting the tears, but making no sounds or movements of distress. Urim's death for her was still immediate and personal, though it had been years for everyone else. Nobody knew of his existence or their involvement. They both had been inclined toward deep privacy. Sympathy otherwise would require a story she would not tell because words paled in comparison to her reality. Her cumulative sorrows made it seem to her like she'd gone to the center of the earth, felt the unbearable pressure, been surrounded by burning, inescapable magma. When she returned to the surface, if she tried to bring a sample of that experience with her, it was always cold stone when she opened her hands or her mouth to reveal it. Now it was obsidian, unique and sharp, and still nothing near her experience. Something that would slice her tongue and palm if she tried to hold it or speak of it. Only a remnant, a memory in a pale, cold shadow. She had stopped trying to find words. She didn't have to tell it, but she could feel it fully for the first time right now, knowing Thane would understand in the way he did, the way Urim had, without being told, by some drell empathy that transcended being able to read a person and verged on the supernatural for her. She hadn't mourned Urim's death or her own death, merely acknowledging the wreck of her life and supplanting it with purpose. She still had purpose, but no foundation of living when it wasn't connected to her mission. And the mission would likely kill her, kill those under her command, kill those she loved. Again, kill those she loved again. She wasn't going to stop or apologize. She would continue on the path that cost lives, making her seem unrepentant, a cold, using bitch. She was walking wounded, her body rehabilitated, but her mind segmented, patchworked, and shattered, some thoughts cut off with no paths to them, only an uncrossed divide in narrow, deep canyons that cut to the center of her world. She was fueled by spirit and stubborn. Being blindly willing to walk directly into a trap had illustrated how very broken and numbed she had become to potential dangers. How seductive the idea of dying and staying that way had become. She had more in common with Thane than he knew, and he had been more honest about it. Thane's arms stayed reassuring, strong, and he rocked her gently. His head bowed so his lips brushed her hair. He hummed, and she was struck again by the similarity between Urim and Thane, wondering if this sound was how Drell mothers and fathers comforted their children through pain or nightmare. This was a sound of pure empathy, penetrating her fraying nerves and soothing, changing a mood the way music would, inherently therapeutic and insistent on its own nature. Urim had done this for her after Vermeer, and that was the last time she had seen him. Been held, been truly comforted and understood without words in her ever-narrowing, trapping sorrow and grief. The person who had comforted her after Caden's death had been killed by Sovereign, and it seemed like a death sentence to be asked to sympathize with her. Thane already had a death sentence. Garrus always comforted her with his relentless insistence on making things right, his indomitable spirit of necessary change. Thane comforted her in the acceptance that some things would never be right, but they could be endured with grace. She needed them both in the way that she needed water and air. Sometimes she felt more Turian, more Drell than she felt human, but she'd had the benefit of the best of those cultures and the worst of her own. Please let me represent some of the best of humanity. I'd like to contribute something. With that thought, she determined that self-worth in this moment would not fall further, would not sink another foothold. Of course she contributed. She knew if she said that aloud, Garrus would have given her a look that meant, "You utterly stupid human. Not only nose-blind, but deluded." She couldn't decide if he'd roll his eyes and dismiss her comment as unworthy, or come to her and convince her otherwise, and perhaps that's where the thought led and was its only purpose. She knew better, but mood occasionally built its own truths from the only materials at hand, shifting sand and fog. Buoyed by Thane's presence, there was a sense of warm rain, his comforting hum allowing the flood to lift her up and out, for her to float along, jagged concerns left behind. Slowly her tears stopped, her breath moved evenly and without strain, and her muscles began to relax, allowing the alchemy of his presence to guide her. Once she was calm, his fingertips moved along her skin, warmth from venom slipping into her mind like slow sips of potent wine. He paced his touches, and he spun, gently rocking bliss through her as she took her cue from him that nothing need be said, added, or taken away. She'd sleep on the couch all the time if she could only have this. They stayed that way for most of an hour, the sensation much like floating on calm, deep waters. No direction, no intention other than soaking in the moment. Slowly his fingers on her skin changed. The water was deep, and she was not alone, and there was a slow, building churning that worked its way up in stronger waves, her own hitching breath. His hands hadn't strayed from her face, her throat, her collarbones, but the subtle shift of his body's tension, the deeper, pressing strength of his fingers brought her away from a state of solitary, comforted bliss and closer to being in a man's arms. She knew venom, and she became more certain that the insidious difference in Thane's venom was not her imagination. She felt like petals opening in the dawn sunlight, the light at first weak and trembling, then stronger, delicate lengths unfurling because that was what they were meant to do, to seek the sun, to follow its path, root-bound and reliant, helpless and reactive. Each moment seemed to reach for poetry, to reassign sensations to a deeper motive while remaining skin on skin, influence and communion. Everything he did seemed to reach a sense of mathematical elegance, of fractal patterns spinning out in predetermined beauty, his palm on the side of her throat, his lips at the line of her jaw, a revelation of what palms and jaws and lips were for. Her skin was warmed by his hands, a new sun and cloud, passing heat and cooling shade. Double-track nails down the line of her throat set shivers and ripples down her spine. She followed his breath, falling into rhythm with his inhales and exhales, both slowly accelerating like deeper waves in the water, a wind moving over the surface, chop and froth and overset splashes. The hard, heated length of his cock was against her ass, cloth and leather between them, and that started a spreading flush of being wanted, a flooding rush of something denied. She knew she was loved, but didn't know how much she was wanted. He'd said no to her. He wanted Garrus, and she wanted them to be happy. They could want, and she could love. Deep into the water, out of her depth. Restlessness of wrong place rose like trailing vines, information along internal walls to be heeded. She was only human, not enough, not for this. No pleasure in her skin stored to be released with a lover's caress, only skin. Thane's gentle, careful touches suddenly seemed condescending, herding her like a child through a simple maze, clapping his hands at her effort. Discipline closed down on that thought. Not to say, not to show. Insecurity of a chosen position loomed like cover collapsing and exposure sure. Rockets aimed. Thane's hands trembling as Garrus kissed him. Karim. Eclipse. She faltered in her paced breathing, clamped down, tried to physically relax, to give love and not want, to not think. Pity fuck in weakening and strengthening echoes through baffled canyons of thought. Too late to not be noticed. She kept her eyes tightly closed, but his careful hands turned her face to his, and he kissed her, stinging, streaming, and bucking countercurrent in her from more direct pyramid, moving through the maze. Hot, lust-streaked mouth, harder pulse against her ass, want provoked in her with ease. So easy. She's so easy. A fast huff of almost laugh, left with her breath. He pulls back and her lips follow his until they can't, and she waits in streaming, darkened, shaded lust, not love, pity, need. Please don't. He tips her chin up with a fingertip and says what please don't means. Open your eyes. See her. She does. Eyes were allowed, but not wanted now, but his voice. No more kissing, no more asking. No more. She expected lazy, thoughtful Thane, sleepy and deliberate, until he wasn't. Instead, blood-dripping, bone-snapped Thane studied her face, superfluid calculation in his eyes. She thought he knew, until he said, "Tell me." No, not his, not earned, not right. A stringent, cold denial sluiced through her veins, countering the warmth, denying his quiet expectation of obedience. She shook her head slowly. The same shock lit his face that she'd seen before in life support. Shock was still good. Very good. And then she knew. Not earned. Shock seen in him, not her. Never pity. Never pity in his eyes. Not condescension, but caution. Blood dripping, bone snapped. See her, he saw. She knew, and he said it. Power given, admiration and capitulation in his voice. You are the only person who can do that, Siha. She knew. Words thick and wrong. She waited. He traced light fingertips over her cheekbones. Did you find a counteragent to my venom? I know of none. She shook her head, and he kissed her again, mouth hot, teeth demand. I cannot make you do anything that you do not already wish to do. Whatever it is you wish to hide shall remain hidden. I am in the dark. Pride and place rushed through her veins, and even balance again, 2 feet. He smiled, lust, anticipation, teeth. Before you become too proud, Siha. Remember, I work well in the dark, and I will find the things you wish to do. She thought, poor Karim, Siha, so inadequate. She smiled at him and said, poor me. It's terrible. Dark eyes, lust, darker. Yes, my yes to give, not your yes to take. All the yes I have. Storm was in his eyes, hallucinations forming cloud and rain and flashes in the depths, the heavy waiting of a thunderstorm that begins with a picked-up breeze and dimming of light, something seen far off, flickering behind his regained control, with him recovered from surprise and wondering what to do with her. He chose to kiss her, lavish with venom. He pulled her to face him, straddle him, moving her until her knees were flush along his outer thighs, her hair surrounded them in a shifting curtain. Her moment of clarity sustained her in the storm, and there was no more thought until his mouth moved to her ear. Jane. He never said it, and suddenly her name that rhymed with plain was exotic and intimate. He moved his lips down the side of her throat. Jane, what if I am nothing but hunger and death and lies? It sounded menacing, and the hair on the back of her neck rose, but she wasn't that fogged or uncertain anymore, hearing the question in his voice, the warning, the attempt to protect her again from who he was. The chills he evoked on her skin with his fingertips and lips were as true as his question, as true as her answer. She focused on the shape of the truth and said very carefully and slowly, her hands pulling his face, so he looked at her as she spoke, and she could see who was important, why she must focus. Thane, what if your hunger matches mine? What if I ask you to kill every day? What if I owe my life to your lies? That called the storm down from him, torrents and flashes that started in his eyes and moved through his hands, through his voice, speaking her name, ripples set loose and spreading. This was recreation of the myth of how life began in a stormy, barren pool, something small and deep and determined, lightning from above giving something the potential to grow and cover a world. A sheltered spark in the flooded darkness of dead canyons, doubling each moment until it was a humming swarm lighting the depths. He gave her his promised hunger, and she gave hers, sharing not silence but the sounds of whispering fabric and sliding leather, lips over skin and hands gathering feast after famine. Shirt and jacket easily gone, she trailed tingling fingers over the broad and color-streaming skin of his shoulders. He drew his legs under himself and rose to his knees, lifting her and bending her back with his arms tight around her waist and his mouth on her breast. Vertigo and suspension, blood rushed and trapped in her head. He gripped her hair and wrapped it around his wrist once, pulling her hair back and down. His palm arched against the curve of her spine, holding her up to meet his lips as he chose. Breast, neck, lips, navel, his teeth at the curve of her waist and underside of her breast, tongue and tingling trails after. Venom again brought her to that willing, suspended state of waiting for him, wanting to be what he wanted, but not knowing what to be unless he showed her, told her. She sensed no more danger, no more wrong, and she relaxed back, wanting to float with him again. When she tried to touch him or pull him to her, he deftly redirected her hands until she kept them on his shoulders, fingertips tracing the texture of his skin. He controlled all the directions she could go, all the things she could want. Lie still, Sia. I want you to lie still. No ripple of disagreement. He'd said he would find what she wanted, and he would, and she would give that. She didn't need to be confused or wonder why he moved her hands. She could float with him, lie still, and let him lead. She told him, Thane, you want to know what I like? I like everything you do. She smiled, and he laughed, kissing along her throat. I hope to keep it that way. Telling you no was impossible, and I wish to make up for my regret. That she understood more fully, and qualms faded. He wanted control, yes. He wanted power over her. Yes, she'd give him that with both hands and let the implications slip away, because now they would have time. She would have time to understand all the things he was not saying. Still did not mean quiet, so she said, What do you regret? He lowered his mouth to her breast and pulled her nipple into his mouth, fast and tight, tongue and teeth and tingles. His hand pulled nails down her stomach, and her head arched back with a tight, indrawn breath and a moan from her. I regret not following you when you could not walk from my kiss, my venom in your blood, your kiss on my brow. I should have made sure you could not open that door, pinned you to it with my body, and shown you that I was not afraid. Intuition clicked in place. Her virulently venomous, deadly, and subtle drill was in the position of trying to protect her from him again, and that was lovely, but... Thane, in this moment, I owe you my life and gratitude. I want to see what you want, as much, if not more, than you want to see what I want. You held me while I slept, comforted me when I woke, and I promise you, if there has ever been a time to take advantage of a receptive, loving, forgiving, and hungry woman, it's now. Show me you are not afraid of who you are now, and let me show you that I am not afraid. Never let it be said that Commander Shepard was not expert at pushing people's buttons. He reacted by stilling during her words and then tensing like a tightly coiled spring for moments after, staring at her. His hand wrapped through her hair once again, twisted her head to suit his position, and he kissed her. Darker depths and storms solidified, and she was caught in electrified waters, sparks over her skin, and inescapable tension of muscle out of her control. Heavy, dark tyramid shrouded her, the urgency and strength of his hands invading the spell, selfish and revealing. His mouth never left hers as he took her hand and placed it on his cock, still frustratingly in leather, and he groaned against her mouth as he guided her hand to show her how, where to stroke, where to trace his length with fingertips, and then slide along with the broad press of her palm. His clever fingers had her hips lifted and her looser, easier pants slid off her body, guiding her to bend her knees one by one and shift the fabric off and away from her. His fused finger was inside her after his palm closed possessively over her, and she let out a sharp gasp into his mouth as his thumb twisted to find her clit. He murmured her name against her mouth with another drill hum of unmistakable intimacy dripping down her spine. He thrust with his finger and adjusted the movement of his thumb until she was arching up into his touch, her nails digging into the leather outlining his cock, her other hand with nails on his shoulder, until his fingers and her hips and his mouth found the perfect rhythm. She tensed and twisted, unable to arch as he held her down, licking the moans from her lips. Sense had fully fled, and she slid down that long, dark decline into helpless clinging. He drew her hand with his own wet, slippery fingers to rest on the fastenings of his pants, which she couldn't figure out. He let her fumble, smiling against her mouth until she drew her hand aside. With a dramatic click, she unfurled her omni-tool blade until he was laughing with appreciation. Sia, I do not believe that will be necessary. Better not be. She sheathed it, point made. He showed her the fastenings, helped her remove his pants, and delivered himself to her hands with a deep groan, returning to kiss her, his weight supported with one of his arms, his hand on her breast. He asked her, "Am I forgiven?" Maybe. He lowered his body until her hands were trapped, gathering them, holding them over her head, shifting his hips and knees to part her thighs. He thrust into her, staying there, his hand in her hair, his voice in her ear, her name. He thrust deep, shallow, pulling back to stay suspended, to begin over again, deep inside, then back to suspense, and then again, his voice deeper, broken, and in wider question in his voice, encompassing a whole person, a whole life. Am I forgiven, Sia? She gave him her voice, answering with a whole person and a whole life. Sia, not Shepard, idealized and worshipped and followed blindly. Yes. He moved, starting from his point of isolated discipline, responding to every indrawn breath and moan, each track of her fingernails down his back, moving his fingers to stroke with feather-light touches between, slamming into her, until he was no longer watching her body, gauging and provoking her, until he was fully provoked, passion and power and pain mingling in his hands and his voice, until he bent her knees against her chest and leaned on, in, through, his arms under her back and hands gripping her shoulders. He came with a shuddering groan, growl, his arms around her, driving in his fingernails on her shoulders. She shifted to wrap her legs around him, her arms behind his back, held him skin to skin, mouth to mouth, breath to breath. She woke to Torian arms lifting her from the bed, a tone in his voice that could be called clucking. He spoke to her as though she were a small child, which she supposed from his viewpoint was fair. You have to eat, Karim. You haven't eaten in about 24 hours. Thane watched, leaning on an elbow in the bed. She smiled at Thane. She smiled at Garrus. I did get some caloric input. I should be fine. She was hungry, and Tiamat giddy, having slept with full skin contact. They had spent a lot of hours building layers of Tiamat amplified satiety, hunger given free rein to run until exhausted. She was joyful and frankly silly, unable to imagine anything going wrong. Garrus switched from clucking to scolding when he turned to Thane. What the hell? She has to eat. I'm in charge, and I don't want to fill out a death certificate with sex as the cause. Thane shrugged. I suggested food. She disagreed. She is persuasive. She nodded, trying to come to Thane's rescue. He did. I did. It's my fault, I promise. Garrus sighed and put a slice of toast in her hand, which she nibbled dutifully. Given the choice, I'm still going with the sex. Thane smiled and Garrus let out a snort. We're just about to Ilium. How long are we putting in? She stretched. 3 days. Bring food. Garrus handed toast to Thane, who thanked him politely and got out of bed. Finally, someone allowing it. He headed to the bathroom, and she said, He has a very nice ass. Thane nodded gravely in acknowledgement with a hint of straight man smile, and Garrus laughed, agreed, and tried to get her hand to navigate to a carafe of juice, but her aim was off, and she was busy looking at Thane. I think he just flexed it on purpose. Garrus redirected her. You're useless. She let him pour her something to drink, and she finished the glass in seconds. She clapped toast crumbs off her hands and turned to face Garrus. I'm curious about something. Hold still. She reached for him, kissed him in swirls of Turian magic moved through Tyramid-soaked blood. New dizziness and billows of uplift and certainty, like music, the minor chord of Tyramid and the major chord of Turian influence, resolving without dissonance, modulating into something entirely new. She murmured against his mouth. I will sign a release that if I die from sex, it was voluntary and exactly how I wanted to go. Where were you? I missed you. I expected you to come by. Garrus groaned and claimed his own kiss, hand tightening around her waist and one hand in her hair. He tipped his crest to her forehead and said, "Wanted to give you some time with him. I figured once the motion detectors had settled down for more than an hour, it was safe to come back in." She grinned at him. "You installed motion detectors? That's romantic and efficient, just like you. Thanks for looking out for me." He pulled the food closer, put a spoon in her hand, and said, "You? I wasn't looking out for you, Karim. I had to pull you off him. I was looking out for Thane." She giggled again, in full agreement. Before letting everyone go on shore leave, Shepard called a meeting with Morden, Miranda, and Dr. Chakwas. Thane had told her that the Hanar were working on Kepral syndrome, but she had less faith in Hanar science than Thane did. Considering his ability to make anybody potentially think or believe anything, she had not so much faith in Thane telling her the truth on the subject. She had a woman who had conquered death and a Solarian who had altered the course of Krogan history under her command. She'd done some of her own research, and from what she understood, the problem was with the oxygen-bearing component of Drell blood. He'd compared it to hemoglobin, so she'd done at least cursory research, enough to get by in a conference. After establishing their familiarity with Kepral syndrome, she said, "Beta thalassemia seems to be a human corollary. Is that correct?" Morden said, "Close, not exact. Kepral syndrome more intricate, but yes, theories on oxygen-bearing vector could correlate." "A human with beta thalassemia is treated with stem cell transplant? Thane can't do an autologous donation because he's already affected, but we do have an allogenic source." Miranda's brows raised and Dr. Chakwas looked thoughtful. Morden said, Yes, could work. Kolyat first-degree relative." "I can get samples next time we're on the Citadel. We can't bleed Kolyat dry, but we can take samples. You can synthesize something, yes?" Miranda said, "I'm familiar with some of the research, but this isn't a cure." "Does it have to be a cure at first, or just the equivalent of insulin for a diabetic?" "His problem is air. We can get him air a few ways, by giving him blood transfusions and by ultimately replacing his marrow. We've got to be able to do something. We need to buy him time until we can get to a cure." Dr. Chakwas said, "He has declined anything but the most basic and non-invasive treatments. He will not allow an oxygen mask, and I've had to respect his boundaries. Even if you come up with a stopgap measure, there are practicalities here regarding his stated consent limits." "Let me take care of that part. Morden, I can get Kolyat to give blood and marrow samples that can be virtually modeled at the Citadel, and you can take a look at it before you get your hands on the real thing. Miranda, your molecular expertise can't go to waste here. There have got to be enough stopgap measures to use: gene therapy, transfusions, optimization of oxygen." Morden said, "Hanar seeking cure. Research unavailable. Hanar not best known for scientific contribution or breakthrough. Plotting. Would likely take a long view. This approach would be considered palliative, insignificant." "If you think their research would be of use, I don't care. We can hack it, buy it, whatever you need." "Not necessary. STG contacts should suffice. May need petty cash for liquor." "You got it. Hanar giving you problems? You tell me. Thane gives you problems? you tell me. Oxygen's giving me problems, I'm telling you. There are ways I could help already, but he has not consented. Jane smiled. He will. Tell me what they are. Walking through Ilium on shore leave was different from walking through Ilium armored and armed. Drell always drew the eye, and their presence sounded like an old off-color joke of some sort. A human, a Drell, and a Turian walk into a bar. They also did not have an Asari in their group, unusual for Ilium. Sitting at a table in eternity was oddly awkward after the privacy of a cabin, awash in sex and intimacy. They were definitely on display. Drinks started arriving very shortly after sitting down, and they were for Thane, who had declined to drink in the first place. He offered them one by one to Shepard, who laughed and dug in. Forlorn faces just made it more fun. Yes, Thane was free to go. Was he going to? Absolutely not. Thane didn't seem like the casual sort, either. Garrus was Taurian casual. It was part of the culture. Comrades in arms here made up a huge difference in loyalties. She doubted that even if they were not lovers, that they'd be willing to leave her alone in a bar on Ilium. Too many people wanted a slice of Shepard one way or the other, and maybe it was a bad idea coming here. Fortunately, Garrus was an excellent conversation partner, and he started with, "This reminds me of Omega." And he was off telling a story, and she was picking her way through the drinks. Some of them were new to her, and some of them were good. Resentment seemed to pile up around them as they were laughing and one-upping each other on stories, even Thane leaning into the table and contributing his own. There was some muttering from a Turian passing by the table, and it was too low for her translator to catch, but Garrus's face went a particular type of blank, and Thane's face went very still. Garrus stood quietly, tapped on the Turian's shoulder until he turned, and then punched him in the throat. The Turian fell, and Garrus made sure nobody was willing to come and help him before turning and sitting back down. What happened? Garrus wouldn't say, just shook his head slowly. Seriously, I don't have a Turian nose or Turian ears. Good. Please, someone explain it to me as though I were an underprivileged, small, and delicate human with an explosive temper. Thane said, I believe, if I am correct, that Turian scent on a human female was offensive to the gentleman on the floor, and he said so. Garrus winced. Yeah, weird to find that provincial bullshit on Ilium, but some people have no manners. Thane elaborated. The word, I believe, meant a sexual object, a thing. Jane grinned. So he called me a smelly fuck toy? Ugh, Shepard, Thane corrected with a smile. An unworthy, smelly fuck toy. Oh, come on, you've never heard that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me? Garrus shrugged. Demonstrably not true. Spectre is a name. Touché. You make an excellent smelly fuck toy, by the way. Worthy as hell. She grinned. That's what I'm talking about. I'm proud of it. So am I. But this way I also get to hit people.